I'm Jack Shaw. I'm a councillor at the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, and I'm a senior advisor at Labour Together.
My name is Anthony Okereke, and I'm the leader of the Royal Borough of Greenwich.
Anthony, thank you so much for coming in.
Yes.
Two firsts today. First sitting leader of a council to come on the podcast, and first person to ask to come on. So we actually met at the Labour Party conference. Or we met at the Labour Party conference, and you said, I want to go on the podcast. So that's very true. Happy that this has now happened. And good timing, because we get to discuss the budget today. But what I would like to start with, if it was possible, is to go back to the kind of the start of your career, your background, and why it was that you originally kind of wanted to go into politics, and how your sort of early career led you there.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's funny, when I saw you in Labour Party conference, I thought to myself, actually, it's worth talking about the vision of Greenwich, and worth talking about where we see the future of development in the borough. But my early start in life, I would say, was probably when I was in university. I grew up in a family whereby my dad was always shouting at the TV, and that was almost our engagement with politics at an early age. And, you know, I guess I've always thought to myself, there must be a better way to engage. But I didn't really get politically active till probably about 2011. And my first step almost getting politically active was probably joining the Labour Party after probably being in my university accommodation, sitting down and watching my local area on fire. And it was the London riots that triggered my thought process that actually politics has a great role and bearing on all of our lives. And if I'm going to take my experiences, my lived experiences, and think about how society and governments address them, the right place to do that would be in the political field. Mm. So I joined the Labour Party as almost my first action to get involved in politics. And there was never really a sense of a plan of getting elected or anything like that. It was just a form of, I want to use my voice to really bring in the communities are quite complex. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it often involves us interrogating the complexities to what communities go through. And that's what I wanted to bring into politics, and somehow found myself here in this position, but noting that my role is to help solve issues, in our community, to interrogate those complexities using any political position I have. And then I fulfill that through being a councillor, mm-hmm. and through being a council leader. And I guess that's kind of how I started flirting with the idea of politics, and I find myself in a relationship with it.
That's a good analogy. You mentioned before we started that you actually did a master's in planning. Mm. So for us, obviously, this podcast is about the future of cities, and that overlap between politics and regeneration, politics and planning, is sort of starkly obvious, I think, you know, and it's not just in London, it's not just in the UK, it's anywhere in the world. Politics and regeneration sort of are deeply tied up. Have you noticed that you get to, you know, as leader of the council, kind of apply some of the thinking that you learned whilst studying planning?
Most definitely. You know, our vision in Greenwich is about improving the public health and well-being of our residents. You know, improving the health of them and making sure that to live life and progress, they need to be healthy. And I think when it comes to planning and the built environment, it is almost the core building blocks about how we as human beings interact with our environment. So yeah, 100%. I think I use it in all cases, but more importantly, it's the foundation for tackling poverty. You know, I can build you a tube station and have you travel into work more sustainably, which is better for health. Or I can build you a road and have you travel in and pay for a car and pay for the fuel and everything else, which has a bearing on your finances. So then you see how what we build and shape in our communities, in our cities, in our towns, has a huge bearing on how we interact with the world. And obviously our job really is to try and make things more convenient for people, more sustainable for people, and more affordable for people, so people can live happier lives. So I feel like my construction background, because I studied civil engineering, started a master's in planning, I've always loved construction, always loved engineering, always loved the built environment. But for me, that is the route in to really tackling poverty. And just today, we've had the Chancellor's speech on growth, but more importantly, on actually how she's going to use infrastructure to gear up for growth. And that's the beauty about the built environment.
Absolutely. And so that your original role at Greenwich in the cabinet was as cabinet member for housing. So you got to instantly kind of practice what you preach, I suppose.
Yeah.
Talk me through how that role was, your experience of the sort of public-private partnerships that I think Greenwich were doing, and also delivering their own stock of housing as well as managing an existing large stock.
So when I was appointed cabinet member for housing, I remember it was in the midst of the pandemic, and I always saw my role as my immediate priority just being about ensuring people are safe during the pandemic and making sure that we protect them and their housing conditions. And obviously we saw homelessness really affects people, evictions, then we saw the eviction ban and all these other things. But from a position of housing in itself, we've since been in position in that administration, allocated figures for maintenance, allocated figures for building in Greenwich Builds, and managing our developments where we already had existing public-private relationships. For example, things that we've done around Kidbrooke in Eltham, things that we've done in Woolwich with Lovell, and other partnerships like Berkeley Homes in Woolwich, and some of the other things that are happening. But like being cabinet member for rental was a really challenging in time, or especially during the pandemic. But it was, my reflections is that there is the housing development side, but there's also the housing management side. And the housing management is a service of people. And housing development is a service of building the products for the people, and trying to bring those two to align. It was a really lovely experience. But in that, we have 20,000 council homes. There's a lot of management that comes with that. Government changing regulations and other things like that has a burden on that. It's not easy. Council housing has been underinvested in. So I guess I took to the role and really threw myself at it in terms of going around speaking to residents, but also making the bold case that we're also here to deliver new homes and new council homes, new zero carbon sustainable homes in small sites, which are quite politically difficult. So when people would invite me to their site and say to me, we want to show you this place where we don't think the council was going to build on, and the officers were really nervous about me turning up and doing a site visit with residents, I was there to clearly say, we have plans to develop on this, and we're going to work with you to mitigate on those issues around those areas that you are concerned about. And I think that's the role that we need to play when it comes to development, is that collectively our value set and our attitude to development should be, well, how do we make this place better? How do we mitigate the impact of development, and how do we get development done?
And I think then showing leadership as well, because often, whilst there are councils building their own stock of housing, and as you were, it's challenging doing that at scale. And I think this incoming Labour government is pledging to do more of that, and that should be supported. But I think the private sector as well need to be given leadership and demonstrated that there's certain places that are open for business when it comes to delivering housing. How did you strike that balance right, both as leader actually and as cabinet member for housing, of giving the right indicators without then appearing unpopular to residents who might be opposed to development?
So I think when we think about that narrative of, it comes down to trust, essentially. And I've learned very early on in my career that it's worth turning up. When you turn up the first time and people shout at you on this wicked issue that is affecting their lives, and they get it all out, brilliant, they've had their go. But when you turn up again and they consistently see you turning up, then they can't always shout at you. And actually what you're doing is the very action and effort to rebuild trust and maintain trust. So I think it's one, showing presence, is that saying, through your difficulty and your challenges and your concerns, I'm going to be communicating with you. I'm going to turn up. I'm going to discuss the issue when we might disagree, but I'm going to turn up. And actually the relationship that we're establishing can withstand healthy tension.
Mm-hmm.
It can withstand disagreement. And that's what public life is really about. So I think I show myself by setting the right value set and the attitude, saying we're open for business, but we're also open discussing the challenging things that comes with place making, place shaping, and place visioning. And
what's been your experience of actually the council delivering their own homes? I did a podcast recently with Mark Bagent, who has worked on lots of London boroughs. He's currently at Redbridge, on how you finance and then deliver your own homes if you're a council. He just highlighted how challenging it is finding the skills, finding the money. What's your experience been of it?
It's hugely challenging. I mean, we've not had significant investment into council housing since, the Addison Act, apart from that, grant funding for ongoing different grant funding and tranches. Lifting of the HRA helped councils get to a position whereby they started to think about building more council housing at more volume levels. I would say in 2018, we delivered a housing strategy paper, which set out our housing and vision, which is all about different ranges of development, council delivery, working with partners and community land trusts. It's been challenging. I think councils have been able to demonstrate what they can do when they're given the right support and resource to do that. But historically, we never had the team to do that kind of work. So trying to rebuild a team, trying to compete with the private market and get that skill set has been challenging, but we've managed to do it and we have got a team in place. We've got a 750 commitment housing target, 0 carbon sustainable homes. So these are more expensive to deliver, but the best knock-on effect of them is that they reduce energy bills at a time where there's an energy crisis. But that's been hard. It's been hard thinking about, because you spend a lot of money on small sites. So it's been hard doing small sites to small sites. In every single small site, you're fighting services, like the services around claiming land. In every small site, you're fighting neighbours and trying to make the case for why this can work in single area. But you're also trying to take people on a journey, right? Trying to take residents on a journey, trying to take your stakeholders on a journey. So I think it's been challenging. I think it goes back to that point, is that, I remember one development in the Brooks, which is what I referred to earlier, we just set up a steering group. Bring in the objectors, bring in the supporters, bring in the nursery, put everyone in there. We are going to work through this stuff and have regular meetings. It's been tough, but the finances have been even hard, because I remember sitting down case by case, going through every single site, approving whether we thought we could make it work or not. And it's gotten even tougher. Post the trust budget, it's gotten even harder to be able to make it. The rising of inflation has made it even more difficult. So I'm sure announcements from today's budget might shed some light on that in terms of how we resolve it. But you would have seen the work done by Southwark Council on the future, securing the future of council housing. And what it's saying is that HRAs, which help pay for new developments, are struggling. They're having to struggle with fire safety, having to struggle with building new homes, having to struggle with managing and maintaining council homes, and having to struggle with other things in there like homelessness and other things. So our HRAs are getting to a position of really tightness where there isn't capacity to invest in new housing stock. And that's the real challenge ahead for us.
And I think if Southwark went from, I think they were the largest single house builder in the country delivering their own stock. And that programme has almost come to well, not an end, I suppose it's a pause because of these challenges that you said. And I think, for how far through your pipeline are you? How far through the 750 homes? And are they still, are you still aiming to deliver those and then more afterwards?
So 750 was all through planning, partially all through planning, the vast majority of all through planning within the 4-year term. We've got the 1,000 commitment after that. So we're doing 1,000 homes, which has largely resulted in a phase 1 to the 1,000, and then a phase 2 to the 1,000. So we're doing it in phases, year by year, securing planning and getting shovels in the ground. So we're on track. We're going to deliver all of them. We're not going to let our HRA slow us down, or housing revenue account slow us down. I guess the question really is that in the midst of a cost inflation for us, we have to think about what we do to almost flex around the challenges. So where we have a difficult housing revenue account, is it that rather than building homes, we're acquiring homes? Is it that we're doing more JVs around our small sites and packaging them up potentially? That these are the options that we have to look at.
Yeah.
Housing associations have slowed down. Councils can't afford to slow down. Private sector is slowing down in certain places. Councils can't afford to slow down amidst of the issues that are in our communities. So I think every council needs to be looking strategically at what partnerships they form in the interim to that slump in their HRA that gets them delivering more things.
From what you've seen of Rachel Reeves's brand new budget, which is literally just come out about an hour ago, have you seen things that give you cause for celebration in terms of your ability to deliver? It looked like a bit more money for local authorities and more money certainly pledged for affordable housing. Can you, like, early days obviously, but where do you imagine you're going to see the benefits of that additional financial kind of leverage?
Well, I mean, first of all, today's day where we had the first female chancellor set our budget. So it's an incredibly proud day for the Labour Party, incredibly proud day for me. You mentioned a couple of firsts at the beginning of this interview. So it's a whole load of firsts today. I thought it was a really strong budget from Rachel, really strong performance as well. Setting out the case, setting out the vision, setting out the complexities, and just being really tough. Obviously, we've seen a loosening of her own fiscal rules, which is good because actually sometimes you do need to spend to invest. So that will help capital projects that are happening. We've got the news about Crossrail going all the way to Euston, or HS2 going all the way to Euston, which is fantastic. But then there isn't the news in there about what could come to us. So more investment for a topping up of affordable homes program. We saw in there money for SEND, which is causing a lot of problems in local communities. We've got an amount of people with SEND rising in our borough, which we need to respond to that, making sure they have education and health plans in place to support them. We've seen money towards tackling homelessness and rough sleeping, which is helpful, and money for social care. So there's still more details I need to get into the finance of. There's obviously the decision on NI, which will be an interesting one to see how that impacts and how that impacts authorities. So while we have seen additional investment come to us, one needs to check out the finer details within the budget. But it seems on an overarching scale, a strong budget, and one that I think will help platform local authorities right up until the next spending review, which is next year. Or the year after.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Anthony. I'm now going to bring in Jack Shaw to continue the discussion about the budget and also his work on temporary homelessness and the YIMBY organisation, which is hopefully going to help the Labour government deliver more homes. So thank you very much for this part one of the interview, and we'll be seeing you in part two.
100%.
Jack, welcome to the discussion with Anthony. So I think we're going to kick off by talking about the work that you've done on the temporary housing crisis and
Absolutely.
how that impacts local authorities and the people trapped in that crisis. As a point to talk about housing delivery and what today's budget has delivered. So if you could start us off with the temporary housing crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just finished a piece of work with Prospect magazine, and we were looking at the kind of experience of people in temporary accommodation. And I mean, what we found was quite stark and really concerning, and adds to the kind of noises that lots of the sector has been making already. But I'll just give you some kind of top lines. So firstly, we found that some people are spending decades in temporary accommodation. There are some people in London that have been in temporary accommodation since the early 2000s. So about 22 years was the longest household we found in temporary accommodation. We're also seeing that people are spending years in hotels as well. So we found a household in Hackney that spent 2,929 days in a hotel, which, to kind of put it in context, it might be fine living in a hotel for a week or a day if you're on holiday, but in hotels, you obviously don't have adequate cooking facilities. You can't wash your clothes. And so lots of these people are in kind of limbo, essentially, where they can't live kind of fulfilling lives. But then there's also that massive financial impact on local authorities as well. You know, this is a national issue. Local authorities are kind of doing what they can in the circumstances in which they're in. But just to give you an example, last year alone, local authorities spent nearly 400 million on putting people into hotels. And in London, that's particularly acute. So about half of that money was spent by London authorities.
I think it was 7 million a day. Is that I think that was the national...
4 million a day.
4 million a day.
London councils said last week. So that's 4 million a day on temporary accommodation. So all forms of temporary accommodation. But that's just in London. So yeah, it would be a lot higher than
and just
that.
to give the framework of that is it's a statutory commitment that the local authorities have to meet along with social care. And if they can't fund housing, then people are going to end up in temporary situations, and that still has to be paid for by the local authorities.
Absolutely.
So what in this report, if any, were the
solutions?
What are the solutions, exactly?
Yes. Well, I mean, in the long term and the medium term, you know, clearly building homes is the most important solution. There's also, you know, stronger rental protections. We're beginning to see that come through. Labour, the current government, has introduced legislation last month to support renters. We also need to see the TA subsidy rate, so how much local authorities get, how much money they get to place people in temporary accommodation increase. It's 90% of the local housing allowance, but the local housing allowance from 2011, so hasn't increased for 13 years. But then there's a kind of non-financial picture here, which is the kind of question I like to ask myself, you know, recognising that really difficult financial context. What is it that we can do now to support those people that are in temporary accommodation? Hopefully they get new accommodation that local authorities like Greenwich are building, but that can take some time. So what can we do now? And that's something that I think is worth really exploring as well.
I think it's interesting. So I could be wrong on this, but I think Newham have got one of the worst situations.
Correct.
Tower Hamlets have got one of the best, and that is because they invested in buying up stock. Rather than building, Tower Hamlets bought a lot of stock, which has now meant that they've got one of the lower bills for this temporary accommodation of London boroughs. I could be wrong, though. I'm talking to two people that might know much more than me.
Newham is in a really financially precarious position, and they put that largely down to temporary accommodation. So it definitely seems to be affecting their finances more. When you look at the kind of raw numbers, though, there are extraordinary numbers in Tower Hamlets that are in temporary accommodation. So it just points to the fact that no local authority can fix this issue alone. You know, you can't really build your way out of this crisis if you're in a local authority. You can mitigate it, but you can't build your way out of it. So we do need substantive government support to help deliver on that as well.
And so you can't build your way out of it. Do you mean you physically can't, you know, divert?
Just because of the scale.
Housing delivery is not the only solution required to this.
No, housing delivery will help, but the scale of the numbers of people in temporary accommodation is so high now that you wouldn't really be able to build the amount of homes that you'd need to get people out of temporary accommodation, because of course you've got lots of people on your waiting lists. I mean, Anthony, how many people are on Greenwich's waiting list?
Probably about peaking 2,000 at the moment, in terms of those stuck in TA, and then you're thinking also about those stuck in hotel temporary accommodation. But you know what was really interesting about the piece, because it paid homage to two parts: the rising pressure of TA, the impact of financial impact on councils, and the implications of it's having, whereas that investment could probably go to building houses, for spending it placing people in TA. But what it really spoke to me about was temporary accommodation as a service. And sometimes I don't think we think about it through the service lens of actually how do you make people's experiences in temporary accommodation the most comfortable it can be, knowing through that they're going through that service. We know it's temporary accommodation. The experience isn't great. Some people don't have Wi-Fi connection. Some people are stuck in hotels with just microwaves or not really any way to cook a hot meal. And I think it really started to tease out, actually, that we need to have a good relationship with hotels who are housing our residents. It started to tease out some of the initiative we're taking in Greenwich in terms of giving £10 to every single household member in the family over across a day or a week for every single household, so they can spend money on good, nourishing meals that keep them sustained. But when you're in temporary accommodation, it can be part of the lowest of the low of your time sometimes. Having no certainty about where you're going to live, having to move with no notification that you're going to be somewhere else tomorrow is a difficult place. And what we need to do as council, and I think that research pays homage to it, is that we need to imagine it through the lens of a service and making sure that we support people through those difficult times, whilst also noting that we've got to pull our socks up, get more funding to councils to be able to support that point on lifting the local housing allowance past 2011, because ultimately Newham and other councils and ourselves in Greenwich are taking a hit, because in some part you're giving us some money and we're having to top up the rest of the money, which has a huge bearing on us financially. So I think that research pulls out the picture really well, and all of us collectively, from government all down to local government, need to be reflecting on how we move the dial on these things.
Can I just add a point to that, if I may, which is, what we're ultimately talking about here as well is the kind of moral case for house building. And, why is that important? Well, firstly, there's lots of MPs that care about it. There's a big group of MPs that are involved in the APPG for temporary accommodation and the APPG for ending homelessness and so on. So there are kind of willing listeners in Parliament and among decision makers, but also the public really care about tackling homelessness and supporting the most vulnerable in our society. And when you ask the public, what is the most salient reason to build homes, they will often point to things like ending temporary accommodation and ending rough sleeping. So, there's an economic argument that's really important, but there's also a moral one that I think can kind of support the case for more house building as well.
Which is, you've brilliantly teed yourself up to talk about your other report that you've recently published, which is about the public sentiment on development. And I mean, you said the phrase there, which I think is a really good one, the moral case for regeneration or moral case for development. And I think, this government and the last spent time thinking about this issue with the Office for Place, the work that they're doing, and they are doing work to try and make the public more sympathetic to development. What's in your report regards to the kind of sentiment? And Anthony, what's been Jack, that's for you, and then Anthony, for you, what's been your experience of, I mean, we briefly touched on it in the last podcast, on the ground, does the moral case to end homelessness allow people to understand that development is needed? But Jack, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I really should have looked at the report before this podcast, shouldn't I? So the first thing I kind of wanted to test is this, YIMBY-NIMBY divide. I personally think it's kind of reductive and not very helpful. I think we need to bring many more people along this kind of journey of supporting house building and understanding why it's important for UK PLC, but for them as well. And their communities. And so the first part of that work was about understanding how does the public actually feel. And the conclusion we drew from that was that kind of most people were reasonably sensible. They were willing to support house building, providing some kind of basic standards were met. And we kind of classed them as, there's kind of three camps here. There's about 65% that are MIMBYs, so they're kind of in the middle. They're swayable either way. There's a kind of small core of NIMBYs and a kind of small core of, YIMBYs that support house building under almost any circumstance. But the overriding kind of conclusion was that, there isn't this big kind of cacophony of voices that are saying no to house building. They are vocal, but they are a minority. So that kind of lends itself to questions about, well, how do we make sure that our planning processes are more representative? And in that context, we might be able to see more clearly that they're a small minority. We also found related to that, 8 out of 10 people don't get involved in the planning process. They have never taken any action of any kind as part of the planning process. So it just kind of reiterates that point. But then crucially, we kind of tried to do some mapping about, in the places where there was a dislike for house building, or they were kind of less sure about house building, where was that? And, we're on a kind of podcast here with a leader of a Labour council and a Labour councillor, but I don't want to kind of make too many political points. But what was clear is that Labour voters were more pro house building, and that matters in particular because Labour voters tend to be in cities, and so raises lots of questions about our focus spatially in terms of house building and density and so on.
Well, it also begs the question why the NPPF, with its new housing targets, tended to weight the distribution of houses towards what I can only see as being non-urban locations. To my disappointment, and I'm being open. I am a Labour supporter as well, but I do think that I'm also a supporter of urban first when it comes to new housing. I think densifying our cities should be the solution. It's more sustainable. The infrastructure is already here. Whereas what the NPPF now does is reweight the distribution of demand slightly against cities from where it was before.
Interesting reflection. I mean, what I took away from it actually was the role of combined authorities, and most of them are kind of city regions that we currently have, and with the exception of London, what we saw is the combined authorities got a huge uplift, 20,000 extra homes they'll be expected to deliver. So I interpreted that slightly more nuanced in that, within those city regions, that development might coalesce around some of those more urban areas. But actually, I was seeing it through the lens of future policy change. So the government's announced, spatial strategies for combined authorities, for example. I see that as quite an important feature of house building and driving growth at some point.
And Anthony, sorry, I need to come back to you for the answer of the question I asked before. What has been your experience on the moral case for housing?
Well, first of all, I think Jack's right about the two terms of YIMBY versus NIMBY, but I regard myself as a YIMBY. And the reason why is because we need champions of development. We need people to speak up, good development, good housing, and the moral case, which you said, for housing and the implications it has on people's lives. It enables people to turn a new chapter in their life. Now, the reason why we need that is because politically, we saw when there was a disagreement on housing targets, we saw a government, a conservative government, not make local authorities meet their housing targets. We saw local plans being reversed. We saw housing targets being reversed. But we also see in local government small minority groups getting elected on an anti-housing platform. So we know the minority voices electorally do hold weight. And therefore, in this era of fighting for housing, we need voices that are going to speak up for housing and take the fight and challenge to those voices themselves. Hence why I regard myself as a YIMBY. But I think you're right in the sense that it doesn't help the two sides argue. It's about how we have the conversation and how we make sure we communicate with each other on the duties and successes of housing. But I think we need to speak more about great housing. And I think, we're not really a country that celebrates fully great development, and we need to do that at the local authority level and the national level, and speak to the changes that we've been able to make in society. So we've just built huge amounts of sustainable housing in Greenwich. I'm knocking on doors, speaking to families who are saying, I'm now paying my energy bills. My energy bills are a lot less lower now. I'm paying probably about £30 a month. That's the greatness of designing a home that's sustainable. I'm now knocking on doors, speaking to people about how, this park that you have placed has really changed the area. And if you go to Kidbrooke, you see that wonderful park. We need to celebrate that a lot more and show people how great housing can be, how restitching our neighborhoods can be. My reflection is that there is a level of nervousness and anxiousness when it comes to redeveloping your home or around your home. First, is it going to have an impact on the value of my home, to who's going to be coming into the area? And there's a lot of fears that we have to understand, the fear of who's coming in, who's going to be living next to me, what impact is it going to have on value, and really, we really need to think about how we address that through the consultation phase how we speak to people's problems, but also speaking to what investment in housing does as a knock-on effect. It invests in local health services, it invests in public realm, it brings more trees to the area, it invests in the green stuff. And I think that's kind of why why we need to be all YIMBYs in that regard and speak up those things, because we just don't have enough of that in the system.
So Jack, Labour Together obviously sort of is, I suppose, involved in national policy and its relationship to local government. Then, Anthony, you would you're the one that kind of feels that. I suppose we can also bring in today's budget in terms of the relationship between central and local government. But what in those kind of two reports do you see the role of Labour Together being in steering a kind of national policy that feeds down to local government?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose it's in some ways less about Labour Together. So at Labour Together, we work closely with government. We aren't government. Sometimes we're described as a kind of political think tank. So we do a lot of kind of policy work and engagement. I mean, the government's essentially responsible for setting the rules of the game. And that's where it kind of adds most value. I think what we've historically seen, and the Conservative governments of recent years are a really good example, is that they have kind of, tried to make political capital out of local politics. I reflect on Robert Jenrick's letter to Sadiq Khan about the London Plan, which was a kind of, particularly kind of political stunt, really, rather than about housing delivery. Or the kind of governments have historically been kind of too involved in the weeds, and that's been at the expense of kind of discretion. And, let's be honest, that civil servants do a fantastic job, but, Anthony knows more about Greenwich than civil servants know about Greenwich. And so, we should give local authorities lots of flexibility and autonomy to deliver, in this case, house building, but the services that they run and the infrastructures that they need.
And Anthony, what's your experience? I suppose it's early days with having a Labour government handing down the rules of the game to you versus a Tory government. I'd imagine it's sort of a refreshing thus far.
I think it has been refreshing. I think, to the point about the letter from Robert Jenrick, what we've seen is a government take a whole new attitude. As Keir set out on the steps of Downing Street, saying, whether you vote Labour or not, we'll work with you. And actually, my Conservative colleagues who are leaders in other areas have said we've met with the government on devolution. So we're seeing an attitude that isn't about gimmicks or game playing, but saying, if you want to deliver for your community, we're going to stand right there on the line with you and you working with us. So I appreciate the seriousness in which they're taking us as leaders, us as mayors, us as stakeholders, and trying to make sure they understand our own experiences on the ground, because we are on the ground. When civil servants set policy, it has a bearing on the ground. And a lot of the time, what we're doing is feeding up into that. And it's been nice to hear the news today about right to buy receipts and the implications of that, because that is a direct lobby from local government. It's been a fantastic demonstration of creatively, we have used right to buy receipts to build housing, acquire housing, do a whole range of things, but we have collectively lobbied in local government to be able to get that change, and government's listened. So that shows the relationship is one hand in another hand in that sense. We both need to listen to each other if we're going to deliver for people.
And that brings us on probably to the budget. So, national policy, local policy, doesn't really matter if there's no levers of money sort of servicing it. What's your, from having studied it for an hour, Jack, you've probably read it the most. What's your initial take on how it's going to empower local authorities to deliver the housing that they need to solve some of these crises? Yeah,
so when the budget documents get published, and I think this is probably the 11th or 12th year I've kind of scrambled to read this sort of stuff. There's dozens of them. So I'm kind of only just scratching the surface in the last hour. I think it was a really positive budget, actually. And there were additional monies announced that weren't expected or weren't trialled in the media. So, for example, monies for local authorities. There was £230 million announced for temporary accommodation, for example. The government's talked about finding some money for these planning officers, these 300 planning officers. We can obviously discuss whether or not we think that's sufficient. And I'm sure the government know that that's not in the long term in terms of capacity building, but it's a helpful start. The government's found 50 million quid for those officers, but also some kind of wider capacity building activities. There's been an announcement of additional £500 million for the Affordable Homes Programme for 25-26, some additional monies to help unlock some of the homes being held up by nutrient neutrality rules, which I think will kind of particularly excite some of your listeners. And there was a plethora of other stuff announced in there as well.
That nutrient neutrality thing is like such a boomerang thing. It's sort of got launched, then taken away, then put back, then it's like in, out, in, out, in, out. Is it out again?
Well, I have no idea, but I just want to make this kind of interesting political point, which is I've been listening to lots of podcasts in the US at the moment, and for politicians on the left of centre, they're having this really interesting conversation about house building, what they call the kind of scarcity problem. And what they're saying is, and I think this nutrient neutrality is a great example of this, they're saying, as progressives, we've kind of asked the housing system or the planning system to do lots, right? We want it to help address climate change. We want it to tackle social inequalities. We want it to provide place space, fund a whole host of community services. And in that process, if that gums up the system, as we are seeing here, maybe a progressive case for the left of centre is to say, actually, let's kind of Occam's razor lots of this, and let's make it a much, much more simple system that we ask to do a lot less, but it actually delivers a lot more homes. Now, I don't know where the right balance is on that, but I think that's a kind of really interesting, compelling kind of
and there's more and more
case.
Compliance legislation. This Building Safety Act is well outside the planning remit, but it's still, as you say, gumming up the system. And I know Nicholas Boyd-Smith at the Office for Place, which is, I suppose, that was created under the Tories, but is now continuing under Labour, and they're talking about what you can do with design codes to kind of standardise planning. And planning reform has been talked about by many, many, many successive governments as being this golden sword that's going to, unleash the power of Britain. And it's being talked again about now. I can't see that. I don't think there's something that you can do that suddenly means housing delivery is viable. Something that you can do in planning terms that will suddenly make it more viable. It's not a question of the planning system slowing down delivery if the financial headwinds are against you. It's more complex than that.
And I think the government's really cognizant of that. They're kind of taking a multi-pronged approach, aren't they? Where, just as I've kind of listed in the budget, they recognise that financial levers are important. They recognise capacity is important. They recognise planning reform is important. So you need to, absolutely. You need to pull all of these levers all at the same time. And, I can imagine that's incredibly difficult to do in government.
Yeah. Average age of a builder, over 50.
Yep.
Who's going to build all these houses if we haven't got the next generation coming through? Brexit is largely to blame for that. There used to be a good workforce in this country. Lots of them have left.
And we just heard Rachel Reeves talk about, is it a skills hub or setting up some national
Skills England?
Skills England. So there's a real focus there, noting the difficulty around the finance staff, that actually we need to do focus on skills so we can meet our climate objectives and meet our building homes objectives of 1.4 million homes.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably worth adding as well, if we take a mission-driven approach to this, which is what the government wants to do, the government set out a really substantive programme for industrial strategy, for example, building our data centres and reservoirs and advanced manufacturing and green technologies and all that jazz. People need to live in places that are located reasonably close to those centres of commercial and industrial activity. And so, there's also a kind of massive alignment challenge of bringing transport infrastructure and jobs and homes close to people. And so that would be really difficult as well. And I'm looking forward to seeing where the government lands when it publishes some of the white papers on that later in the year.
Anthony, to finish off this kind of joint part of the conversation, what would you say would be the one kind of message that you would give back to the central government as the leader of a London borough? What's the pain point that you feel could still be addressed further than what has already been given in the budget today?
Well, I guess there's lots of people speaking at the moment when it comes to the budget, and I don't think we can underestimate where the country has been and the journey it's gone on, from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss to Rishi Sunak, and the fluctuations of the think in terms of how we approach our economy. Now we've got a Labour government, great, absolutely fantastic. We heard the Chancellor speak of the £22 billion black hole. And I guess, this budget had everybody's expectations raised. Where were we going to go in reflections of where we've been? And I think this is a really strong budget that says this is us setting the foundations in advance of a spending review, a 3-year spending review that focuses on how we deliver more broadly. And therefore, I think governments listen to us. They've responded to us in their budget effectively, but there is a wider plan there, it seems to me. So they've kickstart growth by investing in infrastructure and house building, which has a knock-on impact. They're focusing on the Skills England, which has a knock-on impact. They're saying to mayoral corporations, we're going to give you more devolution that's going to focus on health and other things. And then in the 3 years, how do we tie all of that together? So I think what you're seeing there is a very strategic approach to budget setting, actually. One that says, I'm going to take my 1 year, do some injection funding, get the returns in the next budget, and then build on that. So,
okay, even like putting your head on the block here, 1.5 million homes is the target, I think, over 5 years. Are they going to achieve it? 1.5 million homes over 5 years. That's the target that's been set. Do you think that they will achieve it?
Well, look, you've just had a budget cast for 1 year. I would say cast your eyes in where we are in the next budget. On the 3-year spending review, because I think there you can begin to articulate a lot more. We've seen government.
This sounds like awfully sidestepping your.
Not in any way, shape or form. Not in any way, shape or form. Look, we're seeing government invest and work their way up to get into that. Obviously, housing is very key to that. Everyone needs to be delivering housing at the moment. And watch that space.
Nice. Good. You are a politician, so you're allowed to give a politician's answer. Jack,
do the same question to me.
Yeah, absolutely, Jack. Are we going to see 1.5 million homes delivered over the next 5 years?
Well, the Sunday Times done a piece a fortnight ago ranking the kind of government's first kind of 100 days. And on planning and housing, they rated it 4 out of 5, which I think is a good step, kind of steer on where we are. I think the government's made a huge amount of progress already. As it stands, it will need to do more. So, I don't want to sidestep the question either, but I think Anthony's right that we need to give the government some time. It's been in for 3 months.
I'm not a politician, I agree. I think the answer's no, right? But I think they're doing pretty much everything they can to get that housing delivered, with a few exceptions of some possible missteps they might have done on like capital gains. But I think they're doing a pretty good job. But the answer is probably still no, but they might be close. It's the right direction.
It takes time to ramp up. So you've seen right to buy receipts now going to come back to us. Brilliant. We can now reinvest that. We've seen slight changes on CPO, which is probably going to evolve even more. Brilliant. That's something there. We've seen the nods to the head that we're going to get some planning officers. Great. Absolutely excellent. So I think the combination of these things and what's probably coming in a few years' time helps gear us up to that. But again, we strategically still have to work with the industry to be able to deliver. And we've seen partnerships forming. We've just seen Sadiq come out and talk about the work he's going to be doing, investing in new homes in London, in Barking Riverside. It's your patch, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a Mayoral Development Corporation there.
So there's a Mayoral Development Corporation coming forward.
I think we approved 1,000 units just a fortnight ago there.
There we go. So drip at this stage, but we will drip our way to 1.5 million homes.
Yeah. So, the government had been really clear that it was a really ambitious target for the context in which they had started. And they was also really clear that it would ramp up over time. So, yes, it's a tough ask, the government has announced something almost kind of every week or fortnight on housing and planning. I don't think they could have done much more at this stage. But now the kind of task is a mission-driven approach, but with the sector to help make sure that we ramp up that house building as quickly as possible.
And this is probably the most area we need to be ambitious on.
Yes,
Look,
exactly.
I would have a problem if government wasn't ambitious.
Well, it seems to be. I think that and the NHS,
and we all want to work towards
thing.
that.
Yeah.
You know, we all want to work towards that and make sure we deliver that target.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Cheers. If you enjoyed this conversation and want another great podcast about real estate, investment management and development, then check out the People Property Place podcast, where Matthew Watts, founder of Rockbourne, speaks to the movers, shakers, innovators and leaders in the real estate industry.